World, an online professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me just say a few words about the National Humanities Center. We're an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main program is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center to research and write on topics in history and literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. In addition, we offer an awful lot of resources and programs for teachers of American history and literature. You've already discovered our webinars, and if you go to americainclass.org, you'll discover all the other resources we offer for teachers. Speaking of those resources, let me tell you about a lesson that is related to our topic tonight. It is a lesson on a model of Christian charity, John Winthrop's famous sermon. And it asks the question, what did John Winthrop mean when, in his sermon, he told his Puritan followers that their colony would be as a city upon a hill? It is a close reading of that paragraph that contains that crucial image, and I think you'll find it really useful. It's short enough to do, in one class with your students. It is basically a single interactive exercise, and I think it explores the city on the hill image quite well. So I urge that upon you, please take a look at that and use it in your classes. In addition, you can go to our website, Divining America, Religion and American History, and there you will find a few essays written by our scholar tonight, Christine Heyrman. First of all, Puritanism and Predestination, The Legacy of Puritanism, and Witchcraft in Salem Village. Those essays will give you a good deal of background information and also some teaching tips on how to teach this material. In addition, please visit our Pinterest page. And there you will find all sorts of material on a variety of topics. I believe we have several Pinterest pages, and they contain links to resources, not just from the National Humanities Center, but from a variety of other sources as well. Now, when our seminar is over this evening, please go back to the Puritans in the New World website. There you'll find a recording of the program and a PowerPoint. Feel free to use the PowerPoint in your classes. That's what it's there for. You will also find an evaluation. I ask you to fill that out and send it to us. And once we have obtained that, we will send you a letter of documentation of your participation, not easy to say actually, in this webinar that you can then present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever credit your participation warrants. Now, how do you participate? I'm sure you know you've done this before. We'll be going through this webinar, and Christine will be lecturing, making some comments. We'll stop from time to time to analyze some passages. We'll pose some discussion questions. At that point, we hope that you will respond to those questions by putting your cursor in that box that I've bracketed there on the screen. It's down the lower right-hand side of your screen. Type your response, hit that send button. It will appear in the large box above, and I will be bringing your comments into the conversation at appropriate moments throughout the evening. Now, don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a question or a comment, please feel free to make it. Give us feedback on how you teach this material. If you see a passage that's usable in class, let us know how you present it. Or if you see a potential project or an assignment, share that with us. Remember the first law of webinars, or at least our webinars, the more you participate, the better the webinar. So don't hesitate to ask your own questions and comments. Don't wait for us to pose a discussion question. So let's get underway. Very pleased to have with us tonight Christine Heyrman, the Robert W. and Shirley P. Grimble Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. Christine was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 1985-86. She is a prolific scholar, has written many books. Her most recent one, American Apostles When Evangelicals Entered the World of Islam, a topic that no doubt resonates today. So, Christine, the program is all yours.
Gee, thank you so much, Richard. Can you hear me well enough? Richard?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear. I hope everyone else...
Am I coming in loud and clear? Okay, delighted to hear it. Let's move right on then to our goals for the evening. That will, I hope, be realized through our discussion of the documents. Let me add to You're urging folks to submit their questions, their comments, to participate, and really use this opportunity to advance your understanding of the Puritans. And we'll begin with talking about the centrality of human sinfulness and depravity in Puritan theology, and then what seems a kind of contradiction, the emphasis that the Puritans put on the ability of human beings, of humankind, to remake the world. What follows in our Anne Bradstreet document, her famous letter to her children, is a rather surprising disclosure of Anne Bradstreet's religious doubts, even doubting the existence of God, and her willingness to be so upfront about this. And then we move from the private to the public to look at John Winthrop, who you mentioned, Richard, and his social goals for the Massachusetts Bay Colony that he was about to found. And one of those goals, certainly, what Winthrop and Nathaniel Ward, another important Puritan leader, took to be religious purity, achieved through what we would consider radical religious intolerance, no separation of church and state. So those are the kind of general objectives that we have here as we approach our documents. Richard has asked me to just say a few words about the broader intellectual context of our discussion this evening, and sort of situating the Puritans within the history of the Protestant Reformation as a whole. The Protestant Reformation, of course, is initiated in 1517 by a fellow by the name of Martin Luther. Luther is a monk. He is a college professor. He is a man who becomes a charismatic religious genius. But before Luther has the spiritual breakthrough that enables him to lead this radical rupture with the Roman Catholic Church, a breach within all of Christendom. Luther is a desperate young man, and he is struggling with a deep sense of personal sinfulness and the abject terror of what will befall him in his afterlife. Luther is absolutely convinced that he cannot attain enough personal righteousness through his reason, through his effort to control his own behavior, that will persuade God that he is worthy of eternal salvation. And he is sunk in despair over what he takes to be his inability to lead a truly holy life. And then at one point he experiences a sort of spiritual breakthrough, and he comes to the conclusion that men and women can't possibly be saved by their own righteousness, and that's okay. That the object is not to keep flexing your moral muscles in pursuit of a goal that through human effort alone is completely unattainable, but to trust in God, and that is through God's grace alone that men and women will find the enabling faith to believe in Jesus Christ, and thereby to gain a greater assurance of salvation. And there are many people in the early 16th century in Europe who share Luther's spiritual crisis, and he speaks in a quite direct and personal way to their very deep spiritual concerns. And so Luther, as I said, sort of gets the ball of the Reformation rolling, and it falls to religious thinkers of the generation who follow him, most notably John Calvin, to systematize the Protestant theology, which takes its name from John Calvin, Calvinism, that becomes such a powerhouse, reshaping religious, social, political life on both sides of the Atlantic throughout the early modern period. And the so-called 5 points of Calvinism, like the 5 points of a tulip, sum up what this theological message is. Of course, the basis of all of this is the absolute depravity and sinfulness of humankind, the impassable gulf that Calvinists believe separates a pure, holy, all-knowing God from sinful, clueless human beings. The second point of Calvinism, unconditional election, which is another way of kind of phrasing what Luther's spiritual breakthrough is, that human beings are not saved, are not able to persuade God that they are somehow worthy of heaven through any action of their own, but rather it is only through God's grace that salvation comes. If people are elected for salvation, it's not conditional on anything that they have done or thought, but entirely at God's pleasure and the operation of divine grace. Similarly, the kind of corollary to this is the notion of limited atonement. Calvinists believe that when Jesus died on the cross, he was not atoning for the sins of all of humankind, but only that rather small handful of people, that elect, who are slated for salvation. And if you are a member of this elect, if you are one of the saints, so-called, you will find that God's grace is irresistible. That just as there is no way that you can work or will your way into heaven, if you are meant to be saved, there is no way that you can elude God's grace. And this is, of course, related to the fifth point of Calvinism, the perseverance of the saints. There is no way that you can alienate your salvation once God has decided, as he has decided before the beginning of history and time, that you are among the elect. Now, this religious outlook, this theology known as Calvinism, becomes the intellectual basis of the most radical edge of the English Reformation, which is, of course, represented by the Puritan movement. And it is particularly a group of folks known as both separating and non-separating Congregationalists, which is to say both the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who are part of this radical Protestant Reformation that unfolds in England. Many of them folks who, during the reign of Mary Tudor, the Catholic Mary Tudor, have fled to Geneva, which is Calvin's base and the base of his future followers, and they've been radicalized by Calvinist doctrine. And when Elizabeth comes to the throne, much friendlier to Protestantism, they go back and radicalize religion, the kind of Protestantism that is taking root in England. So there we have a kind of very overview here of the broader context, the broader intellectual context in which we can understand the Puritan movement. And so now
Christine,
yeah,
I could just
yes, Richard.
We have some
Sure.
questions. Jennifer
Absolutely.
writes, what are some of the things that Luther considered sins?
Well, Jennifer, that is a great question, and I think that what we have to say about all Protestants, whether they are Lutherans, whether they are the different stripes of Puritan, all of these folks consider themselves, to put it in their phrasing, a people of the book, and by that they mean the Bible. And so if you are looking to define sin, and you are a Lutheran or you are a Calvinist of any stripe, of course, what you do is you go to the Bible. You go to Deuteronomy, you go to the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus, and the standard for defining what is considered immoral behavior is something that they would argue is based on their understanding of Scripture. And indeed, the Bible becomes the basis of civil law in Massachusetts early in the 17th century.
Okay, so anything that apparently the Bible would prescribe, as you interpret the Bible, then would be considered sin, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That is the basis for judging what is right and what is wrong.
I noticed a few people are saying that my voice sounds hollow, as if I'm in a tunnel. Actually, I am in a tunnel tonight. I'm doing this. No, I'm just kidding. I tried to. I've turned up the volume. I hope that improves. Anyway, Dave Faden makes an interesting point. It has always intrigued me. How did Calvin decide that Jesus on the cross was not dying for everyone? I'm pretty sure that he wasn't there. What is the basis of that limited election? That really seems to fly. I mean, one of the that really seems to fly in the face of a really fundamental doctrine of Christianity. Jesus died for all of our sins, for all of us. He gave all of us the opportunity for salvation. So what made Luther and Calvin move toward the idea that he wasn't dying for everyone?
Yeah. Let me say, first of all, that this idea that there is a tiny, narrow elect is more characteristic of Calvinism than it is of Lutheranism. Luther is not a big-time systematic thinker. As I said, he's a charismatic religious genius. So it is Calvin who is really kind of working through the niceties of establishing what is doctrine, what is dogma. And of course, from our vantage point, this sounds appalling. We have this image of Jesus as a merciful, loving Savior figure, but we have to look at this from the vantage point of these folks in the 16th, 17th century, who are deeply impressed with the depth of human depravity. the idea that we as human beings are all just absolutely bad to the bone. And so the Calvinist take on this is that it is a testimony to the infinite mercy of God, that out of his goodness, he has deemed to save anybody at all, given how rotten human beings are. No one deserves salvation in this particular way of looking at the relationship between God and man. Calvinism, Calvin gets his start, like Luther, as a lawyer. They're failed lawyers. And Calvin, kind of never lets go of his legalism. And so for Calvin, it follows that if, in fact, there is only a tiny minority of humankind that God in his mercy will deign to save, well, then logically Jesus could not have died for everyone's sins. He died, necessarily, as logic would dictate, only for a small minority of folks. Richard, are you there? Oh dear. Richard, are you there?
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, okay, we're having connectivity problems tonight. We've been experiencing these things since about 5:30 this afternoon. I do not know what the problem is. We've tried everything. I just lost the connection a few minutes ago. So please bear with us. I hope we'll get through this tonight all in one piece. Anyway, when you're talking about election, you are, of course, talking about predestination. And in that essay you wrote for us on Dividing America, the Puritans and Predestination, you raised a really good point. You said in there, why would any sane person believe in predestination? And I think that's a question that arises in lots of people's minds. Could you briefly explain to us why people believed in this really exclusive, this doctrine that seems to leave you uncertain throughout your entire life?
Right. Yeah. Now, this is something that comes up, it comes up every time I teach Puritanism to my undergraduate at the University of Delaware. I'm sure it comes up in your classes as well. Predestination sounds to us in the 21st century as this incredibly unfair theology. I mean, what is this that, before the beginning of history and time, God has determined the fate of each individual, the eternal fate. He's decided who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, and there's nothing you can do that is going to alter that divine decree. And this, of course, is just, offends our sense of, our modern day sense of fairness, freedom of the will. And again, you have to think about this from the vantage point of early modern Europeans and American colonials who are living in a world of sudden death, of nearly constant warfare that only intensifies with the advent of the Protestant Reformation, of recurrent famine because population growth is constantly pushing up against a ceiling of resources. Life is nasty, brutish, short, very uncertain. And the charm of predestination is that what predestination is all about is not simply that God has predetermined the fate of individuals, but that God has a plan for all of human history. There is significance in every sparrow that falls from the limb of a tree. All of this is part of a divinely ordered working out of history that is going to serve God's eternal purpose. And so what predestination posits is a world in which there is really effectively no free will, but it is absolutely shot through with meaning. No matter what you do or how your eternal fate turns out, you are playing a meaningful role in a cosmic drama. You are working through God's providence, God's plan for human history. And in the end, his glory will triumph. So for people who are Puritans, they are assured that their lives are replete with significance and meaning. Their situation is exactly the opposite of our situation, or the way that many of us feel today as moderns, where we have complete freedom, but we're not really sure that our freely chosen actions amount to anything in the end. The Puritans live in a world of no real freedom, but the absolute assurance that their lives are significant and meaningful. And that's the appeal of predestination.
I think you've addressed Seth's question here in your answer. Also, wouldn't this defeat the purpose of practicing religion if their fate was determined beforehand? If they were already saved, what made them follow doctrines if you were saved already? And I think you answered that question when you said that they, first of all, they didn't know that they were predestined. And secondly, they felt that they were part of a divine plan, and so they wanted to enhance that plan through their own virtue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Puritans would say that you can discover in looking at the way you are able to live your life some assurance of salvation. So if you are able to live in a consistently self-disciplined and committed fashion, that your ability to lead this disciplined, upright, moral life is not the cause of your salvation, but it does constitute reassuring evidence of your salvation.
Okay, well, we've got about an hour left, Christine. Shall we move ahead?
Sure.
So we're with Thomas Hooker and the True Side of Sin.
Okay. Are you going to read this, Richard? Is that our...
Put that on the table? I'll be happy to do that. But why don't I go ahead and start reading? Okay. Thomas Hooker, here we go. The one sees the history of sin, the other the nature of it. The one knows the relation of sin as it is mapped out and recorded, the other the poison. As by experience he hath found and proved it. It is one thing to see a disease in the book or in a man's body, another thing to find and feel it in a man's self. There is the report of it, here the malignity and venom of it.
Oh, you did that very well. Lots of feeling there. I like this quotation from Hooker. Hooker is one of the leading ministers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then a few years after arriving in Massachusetts Bay, he moves on to Connecticut. He's one of the founders of Connecticut. He frames helps to frame their legal code. He's a real mover and shaker, and he is also one of the great preachers of the early 17th century. And here we see Hooker talking about the different ways in which you can apprehend sinfulness. And one way is purely intellectual, that a person can see the history of of sin. A person can know sin as it is mapped out and recorded. The same sort of person would, sort of step back and be able to do a very clinical appraisal of what sin consists of. And so on the one hand, you have this kind of intellectual understanding of sin. But on the other hand, there are people, and Hooker is obviously encouraging the saints to be the people who understand the true nature of sin, the poison of sin, and being able to find and feel it in themselves. And so he's thinking about the difference here between being able to offer an intellectual definition of sin and then to realize sin in all of its fullness and malignity. And I think what we see here in this passage from Hooker's sermon is the importance of experience and inwardness in Puritan thought. Puritans are constantly urging each other toward self-scrutiny, toward introspection, toward looking within. And it's in this way, it's for this reason that Puritanism is seen as just a powerful impetus toward individualism. Individualism is not something that sort of pops up magically in the 19th century in the Romantic movement, or in the 18th century in the Enlightenment, but it is something that is being nurtured very early on in the Protestant Reformation, and in this emphasis on the importance of examining your conscience, examining your feelings, and the centrality of experience rather than simply purely intellectual knowledge of spiritual things.
Christine, before we move on, let me ask a question. Is Hooker here suggesting some way to tell the elect from the unelect? The elect would have a kind of intellectual notion of sin. The unelect would have a kind of intellectual notion of sin, but the elect would really feel it.
Yeah, I think that that's really a nice insight, and I guess that I would amend that only slightly to say that people who are unawakened, as opposed to unelect, have this purely intellectual understanding, and what Hooker is doing is he's rattling their cage. He's trying to shake them up and to say, if you really want to find out about your eternal fate, you have to move beyond just thinking about sin in this detached intellectual way and be willing to take this rather threatening journey of inner exploration and scrutinize your soul. Hooker is, like many Puritans, he is an evangelist, and he is trying to bring people into an awareness of the depth of their depravity, what the Puritans would call conviction, and then to see if conversion will issue from that.
I see. So the emotion he's talking about here. Yeah, I'm still here. I hope you can hear me. The emotion he's describing here.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah, the emotion he's describing here would feed into the being born again and being converted. Fair to say?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When evangelicals today talk about being converted, being twice born, what they are talking about is what the Puritans would call passing from conviction, from a deep awareness of one's own sinfulness and inability to do anything about that sinfulness, into a state in which they have received some assurance of their salvation. And Puritans would say, you can never know for sure that you are among the elect. And anybody who preens themselves on thinking, oh, well, I've got it knocked, I'm going to heaven, I'm among the elect, I'm saved, it's in the bag, that would be, like for sure a sign that you are not, because you're guilty of the sin of pride and presumption.
Okay, well, let's move ahead then. We've got a little less than an hour.
Okay, good enough. Now this is great. I mean, this will really, kind of take us into the bottom line here in terms of the Puritan objection to sin. Herein lies the inconceivable heinousness of the hellish nature of sin. It would jostle the Almighty out of the throne of his glorious sovereignty, and indeed be above him. And what Hooker is saying here, this is a passage from the same sermon, is that what's really, really wrong with sin is that it is a way for incredibly fallen, filthy, sinful man to put himself in the place of God, to jostle the Almighty out of his throne, to claim that the individual human will is sovereign rather than God, to completely overthrow the divine order in exactly the way that in the Bible Lucifer tries to do and ends up being the prince of hell. And so the bottom line for the Puritans is that sin is blasphemy, and it is a crime against divine sovereignty. That it is a form of spiritual regicide in a society that that is just hierarchical to the very bone. This is a very powerful way of talking about what's wrong with sin.
Okay, well, I think we've dwelt on sin long enough, Christine. Why don't we move ahead?
You've had enough sin? Okay.
Well,
let's.
That all depends.
Depends on what kind of sin we're talking about here. Okay. Well, here we have another famous Puritan minister in Massachusetts Bay. Someone who was as eminent as Hooker, by the name of John Cotton. And Cotton writes this very famous treatise on what Puritans refer to as the calling. Puritans hold that everyone has a calling. So the folks who are tuned in tonight are called to be teachers. Richard, you are called to be one of the intellectual entrepreneurs of the NHC. Someone
who is a lawyer or a doctor, everyone's work in the world is what they are called to by God. And Puritans, to a remarkable degree, sacralize work in the world. And by that I mean that the Puritans believe in the goodness of work itself, that your work in the world, when you undertake and perform your true work in the world, that this is a form of worship. It is as much a form of worship as going to church on Sunday or saying your prayers morning, noon, and night. That work itself is a way of worshiping God. And so this is the kind of interesting balance within Puritanism. There are many people, many of my students, who they encounter the doctrine of predestination. They say, well, gee, if everything is predetermined and foreordained, why aren't these people just, sort of lying around and getting drunk and fornicating and having a grand time? Why are the Puritans such dynamos, rushing out there and making a revolution in England and settling New England? And part of the answer is that they have this emphasis on the goodness, the sacredness of work itself as a way of glorifying God, as a way of working out God's ultimate purpose for the world, and also as a way of seeing within their own disciplined, moral, effective lives some evidence that they might be saved. So if you faithfully follow your calling, if you seem to make impact in your work in the world, this constitutes evidence, not infallible evidence, not proof positive, but some assurance of your salvation. But you always need to be careful. Remember how, what a big number depravity is for the Puritans. You always need to be careful to recognize that everything you do through God's grace, and not because you're so cool and you're so talented and you're so wonderful, because you aren't. You're a miserable worm. And so Cotton has this reminder here in his treatise on callings, where he says the strongest Christian is never more foiled, meaning more thwarted or frustrated, than when he goes forth in strength of gifts received and his own dexterity. In other words, when he thinks that he is accomplishing things because of his own wonderfulness. Everything, according to the Puritans, goes back to God. We have no ability on our own. Everything happens through God's grace and God's plan.
Okay, well, shall we move ahead then, Christine?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Now here we have Cotton, kind of continuing his thought, and sort of going off on a slightly different tangent here. Do you want to read this, Richard? This particular snippet from Cotton?
Sure. A man of his rank and breeding was not wanted to hire servile work, but the same faith that made him desirous to be in a calling made him stoop to any work his calling led him to. There is no work too hard or too homely for him, for faith is conscious that it hath done the most base drudgery for Satan.
Okay. Yeah. Now, what Cotton is doing here, and this is a very interesting, kind of it's another side of the social significance of this doctrine of calling. And he's talking, as I said, this is a very hierarchical society, a very unequal society. And here he's talking about a gentleman in New England, a man of rank and breeding. And despite his high status, despite his wealth, despite his prestige, he is, because he is a man of faith, he is willing to stoop to do any kind of work. He will abase himself in any way in what he sees as the Lord's service. For if you are God's agent, if you are working out God's providence, there is no work too hard or too homely, because faith, meaning his faith in God, is, and this is a little tricky here at the end, is conscious that it hath done the most base drudgery for Satan. Meaning, a true Christian, a true saint, is aware of all of the mean things, the base things, the drudgery that they have stooped to satisfy their sinful impulses. When you follow the devil and defy God and do the wrong thing. So if you are willing to stoop low to do the devil's work, you, having repented your slavery to Satan, you would find nothing too base to do for the glory of God. And I think that what we see in this this passage is the leveling potential, the egalitarian potential within Puritanism. Very interesting tension in Puritanism, because on the one hand, Puritanism is very much about upholding hierarchy in society, and we see this, I think, most vividly in John Winthrop's model of Christian charity. The Puritans are not Democrats, and they are not about tearing down social distinctions. And it, particularly in the context of establishing this frontier settlement or set of settlements in New England, they think that preserving hierarchy is absolutely essential. But at the same time, kind of existing in tension with that very due regard for hierarchy, what we also see in Puritanism is this kind of egalitarianism, that everybody is bound to follow a calling, that nobody is entitled to be idle, that we are all supposed to be up for doing anything in the service of God and fulfilling His providence. And of course, the great leveler, too, is depravity. We are all equally sinful. We are all equally depraved. And there is really nobody who is better than anybody else, not even the people who are among God's saints, because they haven't done anything to deserve it. They are simply the the undeserving beneficiaries of divine mercy. So there is, in both of those ways, as I said, this powerful leavening, egalitarian impulse within the Puritan movement that is in constant tension with the equally strong endorsement of hierarchy in society and hierarchy in politics.
Christine, we have a question here.
Sure.
What work would be considered homely? Would that be the stable boy, the cook, as opposed to the governor or the professional man in the village?
Exactly. Yeah. Any work involving manual labor would be seen as homely. The very definition of a gentleman is one, or a gentlewoman would be a person who does not work with their hands. So anybody who's engaged in manual labor would be seen as having a homely occupation. But, and this is very important, John Cotton, any Puritan, would say all callings are equal in the sight of God. So somebody who is mucking out the stables, if he is doing a heck of a job of it, is, in ways that he probably does not even understand, advancing God's purposes, his divine plan for human history, as much as is the governor of Massachusetts Bay. And so, again, this kind of radical egalitarianism, as the Puritans would say, God is no respecter of persons.
Right. Well, shall we move ahead? We've got about 40 minutes.
Okay. All righty. I'm glad you're keeping me on track here. Would you like to read a little Anne Bradstreet for us?
Certainly. Certainly, I do a really good Anne Bradstreet imitation. If at any time you were it sounds just like her. If at any time you are chastened of God, take it as thankfully and joyfully as in greatest mercies. For if ye be his, ye shall reap the greatest benefit by it. It hath been no small support to me in times of darkness, when the Almighty hath hid his face from me, that yet I have had abundance of sweetness and refreshment after affliction, and more circumspection in my walking after I have been afflicted.
Okay. Yeah, this is a great passage here. Anne Bradstreet writes this letter to her children at the end of her life. Anne Bradstreet, the wife of a merchant and a very high-ranking magistrate in Massachusetts. Of course, a great poet. You can assign, if you want to humanize the Puritans for your students, you could do nothing better than have them read her short poem to her husband, which is just utterly disarming and charming. Really a great way to kind of introduce the Puritans as human beings to young folks. And here in this letter to her children, as I mentioned earlier, Anne Bradstreet talks about a dark period in her life when she was not only beset with the temptation to be an atheist, to deny the existence of God altogether, but also periods in which she wondered if, really, if there was a God, if the Puritans had the best understanding of what the nature of God was, what the nature of his relationship with mankind was. She speculates, well, gee, maybe the Catholics are, maybe they've got it right and we have it wrong. So this lady is a very venturesome intellect. And another reason that Anne Bradstreet could nurture doubts had to do with what she refers to here as her afflictions, by which she means the loss of some of her children to premature illness and death, and her own illnesses. In these sufferings, she was, as she says, chastened of God. And what she has discovered, what she wants to impart to her now growing children, is that when she was suffering the most, and wondering if this was a sign that there was no God, or if there was a God, he didn't think much of her. She learned instead that God was using these sufferings as a way of bringing her closer to Him, so that when the Almighty hath hid His face from me, I have had abundance of sweetness and refreshment. She means spiritually, after affliction, and more circumspection in my walking, meaning more ability to impose a godly discipline on her life, and to conduct her own self-scrutiny with success, than at any other time. And so, in a sense, what Bradstreet is doing here is giving us the Puritans' take on theodicy. Theodicy, there's a real $5 word, THEO DICY, and it means theodicy. How do you explain the dealings of God toward man, and especially, the bad stuff that happens? Why do bad things happen to good people? This is the kind of pop version of what theodicy is. And Bradstreet's reflections in her old age are that these bad things are, these sufferings are the way in which God is effectively deepening His bond with humankind, rather than being some show of divine disfavor. And she kind of continues this thought on our next slide here. Richard, do you want to give us you want to channel a little more Anne Bradstreet here?
When I have been in darkness and seen no light, yet have I desired to stay myself upon the Lord. And when I have been in sickness and pain, I have thought, if the Lord would but lift up the light of His countenance upon me, although He ground me to powder, it would be but light to me. Yea, often have I thought, were I in hell itself, and could there find the love of God toward me, it would be a heaven. And could I have been in heaven without the love of God, it would have been a hell to me. For in truth, it is the absence and presence of God that makes heaven and hell.
Yeah, here again, I think that that we really see the profundity of Puritan reflections on the nature of God, and the fullness of God in the Puritans' devotional life. and Bradstreet, in a way that is very unconventional, kind of thinking out loud here, that heaven and hell are not kind of concrete locations in the afterlife, but they are about the presence and absence of God. And here again, I think we get this very vivid sense of the chasm that Calvinism postulates between fallen humankind on the one hand, and the holiness, the purity, the all-sufficiency of the divine. I think that in much of contemporary Christianity, the teachings that many you would hear in many Christian churches today, the emphasis is on kind of narrowing the distance between divinity and humanity, making God somehow more accessible, and this is the difference between contemporary Christendom in most of its manifestations and the Christendom of the world of the Puritans, where there is just this radical disjuncture between the human and the divine, and you get someone like Bradstreet saying that although God would grind her to powder in her suffering and her sickness, in pain, just the light of his countenance would banish all of the weight of her mortality.
Okay, well, we've got about 30 minutes, Christine. Shall we move ahead?
Oh, sure. Okay. Oh, well, here we are with John Winthrop, the model of Christian charity. And maybe what we will do here, I think that that this probably, maybe what we should do is we'll start with this first little snippet here. Richard, do you want to channel John Winthrop for us next?
Sure. God Almighty, in His most holy and wise providence, has so disposed of the condition of mankind, as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection.
Okay. Well, we were talking about hierarchy before, and how essential hierarchy is, how fundamental it is for Puritans' notion of how you establish an orderly society, how you establish an orderly polity, a stable government. And John Winthrop is delivering these sentiments on the crossing, on the Arabella, as his party is making its way to Massachusetts Bay, and he wants to lay down the law right from the outset, going into this what is for him an uncharted country, to nip any anarchy, potential democracy in the bud, with this ringing affirmation of what he regards as the proper structuring of society. And you will note that what Winthrop is saying here is that part of God's providential plan for human history is that hierarchy should be upheld, that there are hierarchies of wealth, that there are hierarchies of power and prestige, and that these are absolutely legitimate. And so, again, the Puritans are, they are no Democrats. They do not believe that social, political leveling are a good idea. It is true that their politics at both the colony and particularly the town level are very participatory. They are very consensual. Landholding is basically universal among white adult males, and it is land holding that allows you to vote in a town meeting. And so participation in town government is very, very widespread. This is a very consensual political system, and it has to be, because there is nobody around with a monopoly of force that you can get people to do what you want them to do by sending the army or the police after them. So this is a very consensual society, a society in which local politics are highly participatory, but yet a society that is not premised on the idea of equality or the expectation that society is going to somehow become more equal over a time. In a model of Christian charity, Winthrop doesn't say that society is now based on hierarchy, but of course America is the land of opportunity, so we're going to chip away at this hierarchy a little over time. He expects this to be an absolutely enduring feature of the colony that he plans to bring to being.
So, Christine, we could say here that Winthrop is justifying class differences, right?
Oh boy, is he? Yeah, and he's saying that they are rooted in God's vision of how the world should be.
Right. We've got a number of questions backing up that I want to get to, but why don't we move ahead? These are questions that I can bring in at the end. So, shall we move ahead?
Okay.
We got about 20 minutes.
Okay.
So we do John again?
Yeah, go.
Okay.
Go ahead, make it happen.
Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for his work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. We have professed to enterprise these actions upon these and these ends.
Yeah. Well, here we have this term covenant, which is so absolutely central in terms of how the Puritans in New England went about organizing their social and political lives. Covenants are used among all members, all founding members of churches. They are used among the founding members of all towns. When you join a church that has already been established in New England, you are asked to sign the covenant. And the Puritans have this notion that as a people, they are all in covenant with God. As a people, New Englanders have made an agreement with God that they will abide by his laws in Deuteronomy, in the teachings of Jesus that are inscribed into their legal code. It's the basis of their legal code. That they will render God this outward obedience in return for outward prosperity. This is referred to as the national covenant. And in many ways, this is, the notion that New England is this nation favored of God. This is the basis for, if you're looking for the ancestor of American exceptionalism, there it is in this notion of a national covenant. And notice the way, too, in which this passage reflects the Puritans, this kind of whole predestinarian world, this whole providential world in which Winthrop is portraying his fellow colonists as God's agents, that they have entered into a covenant with God, an agreement. They have taken out a commission. And God has let them draw up their own articles, meaning their articles of government. And this whole enterprise, known as New England, is going forward as part of God's divine plan to implement his program for all of human history, at least in its New England theater of operations.
Well, I think we had a question earlier about the city on the hill image, and I think your mention of American exceptionalism opens the door for a quick discussion of that.
Sure.
In our lesson, we look at that paragraph and at the image very carefully, and come to the conclusion that when Winthrop was talking about the colony being as a city upon a hill, he was not suggesting that it was triumphant, that it was going to be a stellar model for all other colonies that came after, but that he was in fact issuing a warning. He was saying, we've made this covenant, we've taken upon this commission, and all eyes are upon us, and we had better not screw up. And the stakes are really high. So the city on a hill image, instead of being an image of kind of triumphant exceptionalism, it's really a warning. He's telling people, look, we're sinful, and if we screw up, we will become, I believe he says, the byword for failure, and their enemies. And of course, lots of people thought the Puritans were blasphemers. Their enemies would triumph, and we would be outcasts upon the world. So, in a way, it is an expression of exceptionalism, but the city on a hill image itself, in that context, is much more of a warning. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that very learned people have written whole books on this theme. And the conclusion seems to be that when Winthrop refers to the city on the hill, that he is not speaking just of American Puritanism, but he is speaking of the Puritan movement as a whole in both England and America. And so the exceptionalism is not necessarily identified with what becomes the United States as a country, but with an international Puritan movement.
Right. Okay, well, let's move ahead. We've got about 15 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, this brings us to Nathaniel Ward. This is another document that I always enjoy giving my students because they are so appalled by how energetically he defends the most rigid kind of religious intolerance. And so, Richard, can I ask you to do your Nathaniel Ward impersonation for us?
If the devil might have his free option, I believe he would ask nothing else but liberty to enfranchise all false religions and to embondage the truth. Nor should he need. It is much to be feared that lax tolerations upon state pretenses and planting necessities will be the next subtle stratagem he will spread to distaste the truth of God and supplant the peace of the churches. Toleration in things tolerable, exquisitely drawn out by the lines of the Scripture and pencil of the Spirit, are the sacred favors of truth, the due latitudes of love, the fair compartments of Christian fraternity. But irregular dispensations, dealt forth by the facilities of men, are the frontiers of error, the redoubts of schism, the perilous irritaments, that's a tough one, of carnal and spiritual enmity.
Okay, so here's Nathaniel Ward, who is fundamental. I mean, he's basically the guy who draws up the first code of laws for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Tell us what you really think, Nathaniel. I mean, throw the skunk on the table here. Well, if we're up to the devil, he would ask nothing but liberty to enfranchise all false religions. Let's have complete toleration, and that's exactly what the devil would like. And I think what's so difficult for my students, and I suspect your students too, to wrap their heads around is that the number of people in early modern Europe and America who endorsed religious freedom, full liberty of conscience. We could probably fit into one of the faculty offices at the National Humanities Center. Liberty of conscience, religious toleration, was seen as, by most people, an extremely dangerous policy for any state to pursue. That if you let people believe in any religion that they damn pleased and practice that religion, and God help you preach that religion in public, this was the recipe for civil and political discord. So the few folks who took the position that religious toleration, that full liberty of conscience was a great thing, something that most Americans today, I hope, would warmly endorse. Forerunners of this way of thinking, like Roger Williams, are folks in a distinct and despised minority. They are seen as a real danger to the state and ended up, like Roger Williams did, exiled to undesirable spots such as 17th-century Rhode Island. This is Nathaniel Ward really offering here what is the conventional wisdom. And I think that you can use Ward in the classroom as a way of bringing home to your students how fragile, how unstable, how chaotic the world of the 16th and 17th century is. Which is another way of saying, here's the background for why believing in predestination is so reassuring. The Puritans think of this as, they call it a comfortable
doctrine. It makes them feel good. It provides them with some sense of security and meaning in this world that is so violent and in which peace is so fragile, that the free expression of religious ideas is regarded as throwing a match into a barn full of hay. It's going to burn down the state. I think we've got a little more. Oh yeah, here we go. Nathaniel, tell us what you really think. He that is willing to tolerate any religion or discrepant way of religion besides his own, unless it be in matters merely indifferent, either doubts his own or is not sincere in it. Now this just hits you right between the eyes. If you are willing to tolerate the existence of many different faiths in a state, what this means is that you don't take your own religion seriously. You can't possibly be an authentically pious person if you have this open-ended attitude toward tolerating other faiths. And this is a world in which, this is the world before John Locke, a world in which the expectation is that one of the things that the state does is to help men and women get to heaven. And that's why the state is enforcing religious uniformity, because the state is seen as having a legitimate and essential role to play, not only in keeping the civil peace, but in making sure that men and women who are living within its borders get to heaven. And for that reason, if you want your citizens to get to heaven, or at least have a fighting chance of it, you aren't going to tolerate any religion except what you perceive to be the truth.
Mm-hmm. We have some interesting comments here. Kelly suggests that what Ward is saying is that if we bend a little, we give it all up.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. When he talks about matters merely indifferent, he is talking about tolerating only the most niggling of differences. Effectively imposing a draconian religious uniformity. Right. As I said, nothing could be more contrary to our understanding today of the best way to organize the relationship between church and state.
And Kelly also writes, going back to your notion of why people embrace predestination, security is easy to find when you have such clearly delineated right and wrong.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And we have a question. Why did Ward use a cobbler to deliver this message? What did a cobbler have in terms of status or credibility?
Dave, that is really an interesting question. And I think that the reason that he is, kind of adopting this persona for this particular polemic is it's Ward's way of saying, it's so self-evident that religious toleration is just really, really dangerous, that even a guy in a little backwater like Agawam, who is mending shoes, can see how fatuous the whole notion of religious liberty is. In other words, this is something that is self-evident to the humblest intellect. So why should we listen to this jerk Roger Williams? Let's just keep him in Rhode Island.
So if the cobbler can understand this, anybody should be able to understand it.
Yeah, exactly.
As Kelly notes here, do you think he used the cobbler as the everyman?
Yeah, Kelly, absolutely. This is, what I mean, it's very interesting because we talked before about how consensual New England's politics are. How nobody has a monopoly on violence. There's no army. There is only the militia sort of regularly training and drinking and not doing a very effective job. And so it's important for people to agree. And one of the things that it's very important in the view of magistrates like John Winthrop and Nathaniel Ward to get agreement about is religious toleration. And that is because, of course, within Puritan ranks themselves, there are all of these challenges to Puritanism as it's being practiced in Massachusetts Bay, in Connecticut. I'm sure all of you have heard of Anne Hutchinson, somebody else who ended up in Rhode Island because of her religious opinions. The Quakers start making the scene in the 1650s. And so it's really important to make sure that within Puritan New England as a whole, there is fundamental consensus about not tolerating religious dissent, because this could bring down the whole shooting match.
Shall we wrap things up by looking at what Puritanism is and what it is not?
Okay. What it is not, and I think that, I made this point a number of times, is the foundation of American constitutionalism and liberal democracy. We can say, too, that I think it was H.L. Mencken who defined a Puritan at the beginning of the 20th century is a person who feared that somewhere, somehow, somebody else was having a good time. This strikes me as a very unfair depiction of the Puritans as these kind of killjoys with their grim visages and their steeple hats. The Puritans were very much earthy Elizabethans, earthy Jacobeans. We have liquor bills from ministerial ordinations in 17th century New England that are really quite staggering. So the Puritans are people who enjoyed drink in times of celebration. They were not prohibitionists. They enjoyed sex. They hoped within, but occasionally without, the bonds of matrimony. We can tell from their wills and inventories that they were not going around like so many Manhattanites dressed entirely in black, but they liked colors, and they particularly liked scarlet, which is not what you would expect reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. And so what Puritan is, it was one answer to the question of what men and women owe to society. Certainly John Winthrop had answers to that question. And yes, it is definitely a religious sensibility that shaped evangelical Protestantism. It's inwardness that we talked about, its penchant for introspection, very deep sense of human depravity, a sense of mission. All of these elements are things that we can see in evangelical Protestantism in its 19th century manifestations and right up to the present.
That is true. I think we're feeling the legacy of Puritanism quite strongly these days. Kelly writes, but the legacy is that they were not afraid to stick to their standards. They were strong in upholding their strictures, and because of their rigidity, they contributed to the growth of the country by trial and error and those that separated from them. So, I guess the legacy is, like most legacies, a mixed bag, wouldn't you say, Christine?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. I hope we have answered all of your questions. We'll pause here for a moment to see if there are any final comments. And while we are doing that, let me bring to you two of the questions that stacked up during the discussion that I couldn't get in. One I think you've already answered. How did the Puritans handle critical thinkers? I think you got that. And then another person asked about the distinction between those who wanted to purify the Church of England and those who wanted to separate from the Church of England. Could you very briefly distinguish those two groups?
I sure can. Yeah, this is a very sophisticated question. And here is the simple answer to the sophisticated question. The folks who thought that the Church of England was too corrupt to be reformed are known as the Separating Congregationalists. These are the folks that I alluded to at the very, very beginning when I was doing the little mini lecture. The Separating Congregationalists, Church of England too corrupt to be saved, are the Pilgrims. They are the people who leave England, they make a pit stop in Holland for several years, and then they end up settling in Plymouth. The folks who believe that the Church of England is salvageable and that they can reform it from within, both by staying at home and making a revolution and by founding this successful settlement on the shores of New England, these are the folks who settle Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut. And they are the folks who are typically known as the Puritans. Although, of course, arguably, the Pilgrims have essentially the same theology. They are Calvinists, just like the Puritans, but their stance toward the Church of England is different.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, please, before you leave, check out America in Class on our Facebook page, and don't forget that lesson that I told you about on the model of Christian charity. Christine, I want to thank you very much for giving us an excellent seminar. Thank you. It was great.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to thank our participants. You folks contributed enormously and made it really interesting with your comments and questions. Please check americainclass.org for our webinar schedule. The next webinar will be on Tuesday, October 27th at 7 p.m. We're going to be looking at debating the Declaration of Independence. Please don't forget to submit your evaluations. When we get those, we'll send you documentation of your participation in this evening's seminar. And we hope you'll be back with us again on the 27th for our next seminar. In the meantime, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.